It is a distinct pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker. General Mike Nagata's distinguished 38-year military career includes 34 years in special operations operator, command, and staff positions. Prior to his recent retirement, General Nagata was the Director of Strategy and Planning at the National Counterterrorism Center. General Nagata, sir, we are very much looking forward to your comments, and the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I have to say, as I was looking at some of the names on this Zoom call, the old adage that nothing ruins a good war story like eyewitnesses immediately came to mind. And there are way too many eyewitnesses in this audience, so I'm going to have to be more careful than perhaps I originally thought I would. But hopefully it won't degrade what I have come here this morning to communicate to all of you. More seriously, thank you to Russ, to all the members of the Joint Special Operations University who invited me and facilitated my participation in today's important discussions about such an important set of topics. To provide complete transparency about my current activities and therefore my biases, aside from the work I do today as a strategic advisor and senior vice president for CACI International, a company that many in SOF are very familiar with, which is a high technology national security company based here in Washington, D.C. I'm also a distinguished senior fellow for the Middle East Institute, a think tank also located here in the Beltway. And I also run my own consulting company with the massive employee numbers of just one person, myself, from which I do periodic national security and counterterrorism related work. Now, my goal for today is to speak for no more than about half the allotted time, and then proceed as swiftly as possible to your questions or your challenges regarding my remarks this morning. I have long believed that the greatest value that can come from a session like this lies more in a dialogue with you than in your having to sit through a long-winded sermon from someone like me. I do not appear today to provoke you, but I do intend or hope to be provocative enough that it encourages a lively question and answer session. My object today is to share my views of both great power and terrorism challenges in today's world, and perhaps most importantly, to describe how I believe these two topics are intrinsically related to each other in ways that will be increasingly important in coming years, though in many aspects quite inconvenient, but as I will argue, undeniably true. And since this audience, based on our collective experience since 9/11, are probably most conversant in the topic of terrorism and how to combat it, I want to begin by describing my own view of what the words great power, competition, and conflict mean. For those of you that may not know, while I did spend the bulk of the last 2 decades deployed overseas in all the usual suspect places that you're all so familiar with, when I wasn't overseas, I was deployed to what I consider to be the most hostile, most complex, and most dangerous place on earth, Washington, D.C. God help me. I did 2 tours in the Pentagon, one in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the other on the Joint Staff, where I was the Deputy Director for Special Operations, and 2 assignments in the intelligence community, including my last job, as you've already heard, at the National Counterterrorism Center, where for 3 years I was arguably the senior counterterrorism strategist in the US government. Unsurprisingly, and particularly in this past decade, I heard the terms great power competition and great power conflict invoked with increasing frequency and concern by US policymakers and senior officials. And over time, I came to the realization one of our biggest strategic problems is not the challenges that revisionist great powers like Russia and China present us, formidable though they are, but rather our greatest challenge may be an internal one. The rather unfortunate fact that most policymakers and senior officials in the United States are using these same terms, but very often they do not mean precisely the same thing. So before I dive into my own views of how special operations forces, the broader US military, or even the US interagency should be preparing for or engaging in these things, I want to share with you how I personally define them. First of all, I really wish leaders in the US government would stop making what I consider to be a mostly false distinction between great power competition and great power conflict. Too often in this town, people seem to speak and think about them as if they are two different planets, and therefore essentially treat them as silos. I've even heard a few senior officials in this town assert that great power competition is a civilian problem and great power conflict is a military problem, thereby making even stronger the notion that these two things are islands apart from each other. Instead, I believe that great power competition and conflict are essentially two faces of the same coin, or said differently, two different aspects of the same challenge to the United States. That challenge is an ongoing war of influence that it has taken the United States government far too long to recognize was being waged against us, and is still today far too slow to develop the skills, knowledge, and ability to successfully wage this war of influence in defense of our own interests. Thus far, most of the activity by our adversaries has been on the competition side of this coin, though they've not shrunk from the use of conflict where they believed they could do so with good effect, but also in ways that made the likelihood they would cross a red line, inviting a US military response, sufficiently small. As much as I may dislike this great power adversaries, I have nothing but admiration for how deftly they have played us and are still playing us today, skillfully moving from one side of this coin where they keep eroding our influence internationally through relentless and ethically uninhibited competition, to the other side of the coin where they use violence in ways that also call into question America's credibility and reliability as an ally, while still effectively avoiding America's military and legal red lines, and thereby avoid encountering America's combat power. The consequence of their growing agility and skill in vibrating effectively between competition and conflict is steadily eroding American influence globally, which thereby undermines our ability to either protect or advance our own interests on the world stage. We Americans ought to be very familiar and skilled in wars over influence. I would argue that most of the Cold War against the Soviet Union was such a struggle. But unfortunately, it seems that over time, American strategic thinking has descended into a certain amount of strategic blindness and perhaps even intellectual laziness. Ever since World War II, and particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the United States has been the enduring world champion of strategic influence. Even despite occasional setbacks where our influence suffered some damage, we've rebounded so quickly and so well that for most Americans, it's almost as if these setbacks never happened. Our standing as the most influential nation has endured so long that I think a lot of Americans have come to treat it as if it is somehow our birthright, as if our standing as the most influential country on earth was somehow written by the finger of God on a stone tablet and brought down to us from a mountaintop. Obviously, that is not the case, and any American leader that engages in such fantasies is incredibly vulnerable to the age-old trap of strategic hubris. Of course, influence really matters. Consider how much influence the US has wielded for decades in international financial and banking standards and practices, how much influence the US has had on industrial and commercial standards worldwide, how much American cultural characteristics and fashion trends dominate the arts, movies, and television internationally, how much American-style English is pervasive in international music everywhere, how much America has spoken with the loudest and most important voice on everything from research standards to high technology protocols and formats. And most importantly, consider how enormously and pervasively these things I've just mentioned, and many that I have not, have fundamentally benefited, strengthened, and enhanced both our security and economic prosperity for the United States for generations. Unfortunately, these things are less true today. We are losing our ability to influence or control or adapt to any of the things I've just mentioned. So assuming you buy any of what I've described so far, this still leaves us with the vital question of what should the US government, and particularly the US military and its special operations forces, be focused on today when it comes to this relentless challenge to American influence internationally that right now is not going our way, As all of you know, beginning a few years ago, the United States government, and particularly the Department of Defense, began seriously trying to adjust our strategic thinking about great power competition against these so-called revisionist powers. But for the purposes of my remarks today, I'll stick primarily to the two most dangerous and powerful, Russia and China, recognizing that there are others. I intend to use the remainder of my remarks this morning to cover three aspects of the United States' current efforts to improve our abilities against these great powers. These three topics are not the only things the United States should be working on. The list of challenges we face today regarding these adversaries is too long to cover in my remarks. But I do believe that the three things I will close with this morning are among the most important challenges we face. Though some of you may be surprised to know that what I'm about to describe are more along the lines of things we have to fix about ourselves than things we should directly be doing to those adversaries. The argument I am making today is that we're not ready for that fight yet, and we've got to get ourselves more ready. The first topic is the question that I often hear debated in this town of which should be our priority now. Is it counterterrorism or is it great power competition and conflict? The reason that I think we're struggling with this is because we're making an intellectual mistake here. We're making a very common intellectual mistake in Washington, D.C. to believe that all things are a zero-sum game, that in order to do more of one thing, you must therefore do less of something else. That's a simple, convenient, and mostly wrong assertion when it comes to our national security. And I believe that it is just as wrong on this question of which should we prioritize, counterterrorism or great power competition. Whether we like it or not, whether it is convenient or not, whether it is attractive or not, I personally believe that the United States has no choice but to be successful at the strategic level against counterterrorism and great power competition and conflict. And the talk in this town that I still hear today, that in order to be better at great power competition, we must reduce our efforts against terrorism, is an easy, facile, and fundamentally misguided notion. Let me say this a little more simply, at a more pedestrian level, which is where I live. We're gonna have to learn to walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. We're not gonna have the luxury of doing more of one, and therefore we only have to do less of something else. There are several reasons for this assertion that I'm making, that we have to do both, but I will just stick to what I consider to be the most important reason. And it is this: I've seen several attempts by the United States government over more than a decade to reduce our prioritization against terrorism in order to do something else. And I have never seen us make that decision durable. We've tried on several occasions to reduce our efforts against terrorism, but rather inconveniently, terrorists won't let us ignore them. One example that I lived while I was on the Joint Staff, I'm sure there are people in this audience who lived this just like I did, was the so-called pivot to Asia many years ago under a previous administration, which was not a wrong-headed idea. In some ways, some of the things I remember policymakers talking about, and senior DoD officials as well talking about, when it came to the pivot to Asia, was some of the early ruminations in Washington, D.C. about rising Chinese power. And we actually did shift some military resources away from counterterrorism towards the Asia Pacific, but it didn't last. There were many reasons why it didn't last, but probably the most obvious reason was the events in Benghazi. Now, of course, the events in Benghazi were a terrible tragedy, particularly when you consider the fact that a US ambassador died in the process. But all the deaths were tragic. But considering the amount of mortality that happened that day, the amount of actual physical loss of American life was pretty small. But all of you remember what happened after Benghazi. It became such a political firestorm in our own country, particularly here in Washington, D.C., that not only did we retrieve all of the assets that we had previously shifted over to the Asia Pacific, we actually took assets away from the Asia Pacific to create what I'm sure many of you remember was the, quote, new normal executive order for establishing a larger security presence in and around North Africa. And that endured for years, much longer than the pivot to Asia did. But why isn't it durable? There are other examples I can give, but I won't belabor the point. Why do I believe it's not durable? Why don't I consider what happened with the pivot to Asia to be a one-off? I believe the answer lies in something all of you know very well, but I often see people in this town fail to intellectually connect with their decision-making. And that is, the act of terrorism is fundamentally a political act. Terror, if you look up the classic definition of terrorism, it doesn't say that the purpose of terrorism is to kill people, although kill people they certainly do. The purpose of terrorism is to cause political change through violence. So it is inherently a political act. And let's face it, in our government, in every government on the planet, particularly Western democracies like ours, the most senior leaders in our government are political actors. Their personal senses are most finely tuned to detect and to deal with unpleasant or pleasant changes in their political environment. And terrorism, even though the amount of mortality it creates may be very small, sends powerful shockwaves into their political senses. And so, whether or not terrorism actually constitutes an existential threat to the United States in the ways that a country like Russia or China might, it makes little difference when it comes to the way we react to terrorism. And I do not believe that is ever going to change. We can tell ourselves that we're going to discipline ourselves to be less concerned about terrorism so we can deal with the more existential threats of a Russia or China-like adversary. But I've heard this for over a decade, and I've yet to see it stick. I've yet to see it be a durable decision. So I think it's time for all of us, particularly people in this town, to realize we have no choice but to excel at both. And turning our back on terrorism will not and cannot last. I know there are a few people in this audience that have the same memories that I do related to Iraq, now including Syria, where some of us were very concerned with the decision to withdraw military forces in 2011, but 3 years later, we had to go right back. Why? Because while our back was turned, the remnants of AQI that we had set out to defeat all those years ago became the monster called the Islamic State. So I'll stop on this topic with just this stark warning. If we decide to turn our back on terrorism in order to do better at great power competition, it won't last. We will have to go back to terrorism. So, like I said before, it sucks to have to walk and chew bubble gum at the same time, but we have no choice. We have to do both. The second topic I want to cover is also related to a connection between terrorism and great power competition and conflict. But in this particular topic, I would argue that we are seeing an increasing convergence between terrorism and great power competition and conflict. Now, that may strike some of you as odd, but I think there is tangible evidence of this assertion. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. But before I do that, I want to add one other thing. I believe that this convergence between terrorism and great power competition will probably be described by future historians as a return to a very old, classic style of competition and conflict that's never gone away, but the term itself has fallen out of use in most intellectual national security circles here in Washington, D.C., but I believe it's going to return. And that very old style of competition and conflict is proxy warfare. And it is proxy warfare that is at the heart of this convergence between terrorism and great power competition and conflict. But I said I would give you a few examples of what I mean, so here goes. First of all, the effective employment and support of Russian ethnic separatists in places like the Ukraine by the Russian state. Some people might style at least a few of those ethnic separatists as terrorists. They certainly were not regarded by many people in the West as being a legitimate instrument of a sovereign state government. So they probably do, to one degree or another, fit the definition of violent extremist, but they were a proxy of Russia and still are today. And just as importantly, consider the capabilities those Russian separatists were able to deploy on the military battlefield. First world weaponry and first world technology that was obviously provided by their great power sponsor. That's example number one of a convergence between something one might call terrorism and great power competition and conflict. Second example, one that this audience, particularly those of you that have spent a lot of time in the Central Command arena, are very familiar with. The military capabilities and performance of an organization that some in the Middle East do call terrorists, the tribal group called the Houthis in Yemen. Consider what the Houthis, enabled by their great power sponsor, Iran, are able to do today. They are able to effectively employ short-range, surface-to-surface ballistic missiles. They are able to operate, deploy, and effectively employ increasingly long-range, increasingly autonomous, weaponized, unmanned aerial systems. They are also capable of employing precision-guided, surface-to-surface precision-guided naval cruise missiles against commercial and military shipping off the Yemeni coast. Where did they get these capabilities and technologies? They got them from Iran. Increasingly, the Houthis are learning how to fabricate them locally, but the expertise came from Iran. And again, this is a convergence between a group that some would call a terrorist and a great power sponsor. Finally, and perhaps most inconveniently, I'm not trying to offend anybody in the room, I was personally involved in this as well, but there are those who can credibly claim that the Syrian Kurds in northeast Syria for several years now have been proxies of the United States. And as all of you know very well, there is at least one nation on earth that believes every single member of that Syrian Kurd formation are members of the PKK and therefore are international terrorists. We tend not to agree with that, but it really doesn't matter whether we agree with it if everyone else believes it's true. And a lot of people believe it's true. But just as those ethnic Russian separatists in Ukraine and the Houthis in Yemen, consider the capabilities we provided to or supported the Kurds with during several years of combat operations against the Islamic State. Again, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, this can be characterized as a convergence between violent extremism and the strategic ambitions of a sovereign state. I've only given you 3 examples. There are so many more. I'll actually mention 1 or 2 others before I finish. But here's the point. Proxies are increasingly capable, and as they become increasingly capable, they become more and more irresistibly attractive as a partner and proxy of a sovereign state government trying to figure out how to achieve its own strategic goals. One of the principal reasons these proxies are increasingly capable is not just because they have a great power patron. It's also because of the proliferating and increasingly affordable high technology that is becoming available to anyone with a credit card. The fact that these high technologies can be obtained on the open market without much in the way of regulatory control or even tracking makes potential proxies much more capable than they once were. And this is on top of the age-old reason for any sovereign state to consider a partnership with a proxy. It's always convenient to have someone else do your bleeding and your dying for you. The third topic, and perhaps the most important one of all, in my view, hews back to the assertion I made earlier that competition and conflict are simply two faces of the same coin. I believe that the United States is rapidly moving into a new reality where the decisive ground that we have historically alluded to for centuries is increasingly not physical ground at all, and increasingly happening in the competition over high technology capabilities before we ever engage in conflict. Now, what do I mean by that? If you agree with my earlier assertion that the erosion of confidence, the erosion of our influence during the competition phase of our struggle with great power competitors is ongoing and one we are not prevailing in, then I would argue you therefore must believe it is directly inhibiting and limiting our ability to succeed if we ever come to blows in great power conflict. If you don't believe that, I have to tell you I believe it. We are setting the stage either for our future victory or defeat in conflict by how well or how poorly we perform during competition. And as I've already alluded to, I think the best example of this is what I see happening when it comes to competition over who creates the greatest capabilities in the arena of high technology. And frankly, I believe the United States' current failure to more seriously invest in or to keep pace with blistering advances in high technology, while we are still on the competition side of the coin I previously described, are leaving us incredibly vulnerable to having our ability to someday fight these great power competitors being eroded and undermined right before our very eyes. Said more simply, I believe that if we do not fix ourselves as a country and as a government in investing in and more rapidly grasping these, as I've already said, blistering advances in technology, which right now we're not succeeding at, we're going to find ourselves on the wrong end of Sun Tzu's famous maxim that the acme of skill is to win without fighting. I said I would give you some examples, so here goes. These are more recent examples than the ones, at least one of them is a more recent example than the ones I've previously inflicted on you. If you've been tracking what's been happening in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, the renewal of conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, you've probably seen read some open source reporting. I'm sure there's some classified reporting on this as well, about how Azerbaijan has been successfully using a combination of everything from Turkish to Israeli drones to destroy Armenian armor formations on the battlefield. Some of the reporting I've read seems to indicate that the Azerbaijanis are using small, weaponized, commercially available drones in kamikaze attacks against both light and thick-skinned vehicles very successfully, while they have larger, more capable drones orbiting overhead, probably to do their intelligence gathering, targeting, and command and control overwatch. Ask yourselves this question: is anyone in the US military capable of doing what I just said today? Mostly the answer is no. Yet Azerbaijan, a country with I think a $50 billion GDP, is capable of doing it. Obviously they're getting help, but they're still able to do it. They do it for their own purposes, but they also do it in response to the encouragement of their great power patrons. Another example, which is an older example and one that I suspect some in the audience are personally familiar with, was the fact that in 2014, US Special Operations Forces that were partnered with Iraqi Special Forces on the battlefield against ISIS started to be attacked by weaponized commercial drones that ISIS was employing. I was the commander of SOCCENT at that time. There were other commanders like me. We started sending messages and emails up the chain of command asking for capability that will allow us to detect and defeat ISIS increasing employment of these drones. And while we have made some improvements in the years that have elapsed since 2014, I don't think anyone can arguably claim we've solved that problem. And it's been a long time since 2014. It's been 6, almost 7 years, and we still have not solved that problem. And the reason I want to highlight this is because of my assertion earlier that we are not keeping pace with technology. And I think the fact that after 7 years of effort, we have still not been able to solve a problem of pretty simplistic, not very advanced, weaponized commercial drones on a counterterrorism battlefield is not something that should inspire a great deal of confidence that we're ready to tangle with high technology weaponry or systems that a great power might employ against us someday in great power conflict. Finally, and something that I'm sure has come up so far in other discussions in this forum so far, the Chinese investment in technologies, primarily technologies as opposed to weaponry, that give them the ability to create anti-access and area denial capabilities in the South China Sea. What should scare us about that is not things like their hypersonic missiles, as dangerous as those are. What ought to really frighten us is the fact that they have sensors that can effectively collect the intelligence and do the targeting for such high-speed, long-range weaponry. This is an area, by the way, the ability to gather intelligence at a distance and do exquisite targeting at a distance, that whether we realize or not, we once believed was the sole proprietary domain of the United States government. That monopoly, if we did believe that, has been completely shattered by the Chinese. Now, I know that this has been very encouraging and very uplifting for all of you. It wasn't actually my intent to bring anybody down, but as I said at the outset, my goal was not to provoke you, but I hope I have been provocative. We have a serious problem on our hands here, and as I said earlier, our biggest problems are really internal problems. Not that we don't have problems with our adversaries, we certainly do, but we are not, in my judgment, personal opinion here, we are not intellectually consistent or intellectually adequate right now when it comes to facing these challenges of great power competition and great power conflict. And we really have to disabuse ourselves. We have to expunge this idea that it's a zero-sum game between great power competition and conflict versus counterterrorism. Terrorism will not let us turn our back on it for very long. So I guess I'll close by sharing a story with all of you that's a counterterrorism related story, but I think once I finish this story, you'll realize that there are threads of truth from this story that affect our aspirations, or should affect our aspirations and our decisions when it comes to both counterterrorism and great power competition. And the story in many ways says more about us than it does of either our terrorist or great power adversaries. So this was my last trip to Iraq before I retired. I was at the National Counterterrorism Center, but I was invited to return to Iraq to meet with the Iraqi government to talk about their aspirations for a new counterterrorism strategy. As I'm sure many of you would already anticipate, upon my arrival in Baghdad, and aside from the meeting I had with my Iraqi counterparts, the embassy insisted that I meet with some of the Kurds because that's just politically the right thing to do. And of course, I understood that. So I agreed to have a meeting with a senior Kurdish official. It was actually the head of the PUK Intel Service, Lahore Talabani, up in Sulaymaniyah, a place I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I was quite impressed with that gentleman. He spoke better English than I did. And I was impressed enough that towards the end of the conversation, I figured I could ask him a potentially awkward question. Now, this was circa 2016. So as all of you remember, there was a lot of debate brewing at the time, and it got even louder in ensuing years about what are America's long-term intentions and what should our long-term presence be in this part of the Middle East that we had previously departed in 2011. So I asked Mr. Talabani toward the close of our meeting, Mr. Talabani, what do you think happens if America decides, once ISIS has been defeated, that it is time again for us to depart? Mr. Talabani started laughing. And here's what he said to me. He said, "Oh, General Nagata, what happened the last time you decided to leave in 2011? You had to come right back. So if you leave now, we are not worried. You will be back." I don't share that just because of whatever quotient of humor it has. And I don't share that only because its relevance for our counterterrorism reality. Mr. Talabani saw us more clearly than we did. That is not a good strategic position for us to be in. So when it comes to great power competition and conflict or counterterrorism, the job one, I believe, is to see ourselves more clearly than we are currently succeeding at. That's the end of my remarks. I hope I didn't go on too long, and I would be delighted to answer your questions or field any of your comments. Thank you.
Well, sir, we're delighted that you're delighted to answer some questions, because I have enough questions to ask you to keep you around until about 1600 this afternoon. But I will try and consolidate some of them so we can get on with it. So this actually question comes from our director and president, Dr. Wilson. It says, "Sir, please share with us your foresighting of innovations and adaptations of our traditional ways of foreign assistance, security cooperation assistance, and FMS more specifically, to better enable the United States to build partner capacity for overmatching future convergence to which you have spoken." I think there are about 3 questions in there, sir, but I'll let you figure them out.
I'll do what any reasonably savvy participant or presenter like me will do. I'll only cherry pick the ones I have a decent answer for. I'll ignore the rest of it, Russ. But thank you. It is a great question. I'm going to start by saying that while we certainly have structural problems, we probably have some we certainly have some policy dysfunction when it comes to these topics: security assistance, foreign assistance, the ways in which they should interrelate with each other. I personally believe our biggest problem is we don't invest enough in long-term human relationships with our foreign partners that, in my view, are the seedbed within which a useful security assistance or foreign assistance relationship can grow. Too often, what we do, this is particularly true of the Department of Defense, but can be true of other organizations as well, we think that a 1 or 2 or 3 year tour in a country is sufficient when it comes to building relationships, and it is not. Now, this is a painful truth, because as soon as I say something like this, I'm sure there are people in the audience say, "Hold on a second, I haven't seen my family for years already." So now, the logical conclusion you have to come through after listening to Crazy Man Nagata is that everybody's going to have to be separated from their families even more. Well, that's only true if we refuse to deploy the families, but there are dangerous places in the world. But here's the awful truth that we have to more effectively grapple with. If an actor abroad cannot cultivate the personal friendships, not just relationships, the personal friendships that only come after years of association, the likelihood that actor is going to be able to persuade and influence his counterparts to make difficult, painful, sometimes even somewhat dangerous decisions on behalf of the United States government in either the realm of security assistance, foreign assistance, military assistance, what have you, goes down commensurately. So there's a conversation that I think the United States government should be having, both on the military and the civilian side, about length of tours. One thing is for sure, our current habit in the United States government, in the United States military, of deployments of less than a year and sometimes substantially less than a year are strategically dangerous to us. It directly impedes our ability to be effective at this assistance game, whether it's military or civilian. Okay, that's the first part of my answer. Second part of my answer. I also believe there should be a reconsideration. This may take legislation. I'm not enough of a legal expert to know. But there has to be a reckoning over right now what we currently treat as too often as individual silos, and that is foreign and security assistance that is legally under the aegis of the Secretary of State, and other forms of military assistance which are under the Secretary of Defense's Title X authorities. As anyone who's ever been abroad of any significant time knows, too often these supposedly harmonious activities end up colliding with each other as opposed to mutually supporting each other. Now, a lot of that is attributed to the fact that some of these activities are under the authority of the Sec State and some of these authorities are under the authority of the Sec Def. And I have no idea if either an administration or a Congress would be willing to redress that. But we've got to find a way to synchronize these things far more consistently and effectively than we have in the past. And by the way, if you buy any of the remarks that I just made in my prepared presentation, the need for harmony and mutual support between these two worlds is rising. It's not static and it's not descending. The consequences of our inability to make these things harmonious with each other are getting worse and worse over time. Thanks for the question.
I have another question that's really been asked by 3 different people, and I'm editing a little bit, but not much. But before I ask this, I have to remind you this is a totally unclassified forum, okay? Do you think we need to restructure or create new military organizations or entities that are specifically assessed, trained, and educated for competing below the level of armed conflict in order to bridge this, it says civil-military divide, but it probably meant that to engage in the new security environment?
From my point of view, the answer is a resounding yes. What I'm about to suggest will be so hard to do because it crosses so many tribal boundaries inside the United States government. But it's a fair question, so I ought to try to make a fair effort at an answer. Because, as I asserted in my prepared remarks, I believe we set the stage for our defeat or victory in a future great power conflict by how well or how poorly we perform during great power competition. If you buy that, then I think the logical extension is that we need organizations which are inherently interagency in nature, and in my judgment will often be led, should be led, would be best led by a civilian leader as opposed to a military leader, so that we are much better on the competition side of the coin that I previously described. Militaries have a role to play, even if it's only in things like capacity building or professionalization of someone's military. There are many other things beside, but the military often will not be the lead actor in competition, but they have to be a participant. But we don't have a regular habit of creating these interagency deployed structures. And we certainly have no tradition, almost no tradition, or a few exceptions, but we have almost no tradition, no practice of insisting on training and preparing together, in some cases for months, in some cases for years, so that we're more effective once engaged in that competition. What I'm suggesting would probably take legislation. It would certainly require some massive cultural changes, both on the civilian side and the military side. But the price of not doing it, I'm probably talking about right now, I think the term of art is combined joint interagency task forces. It's incredibly painful to do. Some of you know that I personally engaged in this kind of work on several different occasions. It's some of the hardest stuff I've ever had to do. But the price of not doing it is defeat. we will fare so poorly in competition that by the time the first shot is fired in conflict, we'll have already lost.
Next question is actually also been asked by 3 people, not just in this session, but in our session yesterday. What role can the United States military, and SOF in particular, play in a third side of a coin, great power cooperation? Now, never seen a coin with 3 sides, but I'm not sure anyway, but you get the idea, sir.
I do indeed. Thank you. It's a great question. Well, I'm gonna take the presenter's liberty of expanding on the question a little bit. I'll try to answer the question, but I'm going to make the question a little bit larger. And I'm going to stick primarily to SOF. If I don't forget, I'll try to talk about the rest of DoD. But since this is mostly a SOF forum, I'm going to start with Special Operations Forces. Whether it's competition or conflict or cooperation, the greatest contribution SOF has to make, in my view, is the same contribution we have told ourselves is our most important responsibility in everything we do. We tell this to ourselves in our own schoolhouses. Many years ago, I ran the Q course at Fort Bragg. I used to preach this at my students. Whatever else we are supposed to be good at, shooting, moving, communicating, jumping out of airplanes, whatever it is, whatever other skills we're supposed to be fantastic at, the most important skill of all is we're supposed to be the world's greatest problem solvers. We're supposed to be the people that you can hand some crazy Rubik's Cube Gordian knot problem, and our attitude is not to roll our eyes or take a deep sigh and say, oh my God, I don't know how to solve this problem. Our response is supposed to be, our culture is supposed to be, let me at that problem. I will figure it out. I will improvise, I will adapt, and I will overcome. I'm either going to solve this problem or I'm going to die of old age. That is the single greatest contribution we have to make in all of these things. Competition, conflict, and cooperation. Now, obviously, it will take different forms in these 3 things, but the reason I'm being a little strident about this, and take all this with a grain of salt as a retired SOF guy, who has no responsibility for success anymore. I have seen a few of my colleagues fall into the trap of thinking, oh, well, but great power conflict is different, or great power competition is different, and we're going to have to adopt a new way of doing things. You may adopt new technologies, you may adopt different approaches, but the core strength of SOF has been our ability to solve a wicked problem that defies everyone else's efforts. So that, in my personal opinion, is our greatest contribution. I'll add one last thing because I don't want to get just hung up on this one thing. And it hews back to something I said about relationships. Special Operations Forces aren't perfect at this. We screw up as often as we succeed when it comes to forging long-term relationships. But because our success so often depends on them, we tend to be better at it than most other people. So we could do a lot in terms of coaching and teaching some of our interagency and military partners. That probably sounds arrogant as hell for those of you in the audience that are not part of the SOF tribe. I'm not trying to be arrogant, but we do this all day long, every day in conflict-affected areas. And we have lessons to impart, and we ought to not just keep that stuff to ourselves. Over.
Sir, our audience is going to think that I prepped you for this particular keynote speech, because you have, in just about 5 minutes, you've hit on 5 of the key components of this particular forum. So the good news is we're thinking alike. I think there is no bad news, but other than we have more questions for you. This is another question that I've synthesized a little bit, and because of your time at Fort Bragg and the Q course, this is an appropriate question. Does the United States need to reform professional military education in order to change how we compete, below the level of armed conflict. And you notice a common theme here, below the level of armed conflict.
Indeed, I do note that, and I totally agree with it. As I've already asserted, we're setting ourselves up for defeat or victory by what we do in competition. Not that we shouldn't get ready for conflict. I don't want to be misunderstood here. Do I vote? You know, I alluded to hypersonic missiles earlier. Do I vote for the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, you know, feverishly working on the next hypersonic missile if we ever come to blows with China or Russia? Absolutely. I want us to win every physical fight we're ever in, and we should win every physical fight we're ever in. But what we need to understand is that because of our current inadequacies in competition, by the time we get to the point we feel compelled to fire a hypersonic missile, it may already be too late. There's an analogy to be drawn here. I'll come back to your question here in a second. I just can't resist using another historical analogy. You know, anyone who's ever studied World War II learns one way or another that the seeds of France's defeat at the beginnings of World War II were planted in the German Kriegsakademie in the 1930s, when people like, you know, younger versions of the Mansteins, Guderians, and what have you, were formulating what eventually became their version of air-land battle, Blitzkrieg. By the time by the time German armor was going through the Ardennes, the French had already lost. They just didn't know it. And I worry sometimes that that's the road the United States may be inadvertently going down. But coming back to the question, yes, there are things we should be doing in terms of professional education and professional training. The list is actually quite long, so I'll stick to what I personally believe is the most important one. It's both an educational issue as well as an assignment issue. There should be funding for far more civilian professionals from other agencies of the US government in all military educational institutions. Every war college, the Naval Postgraduate School. Right now, a tiny fraction of the student body are foreign service officers, intelligence officers from civilian agencies, et cetera. There should be a lot more of them. But here's the reason why it will require more funding. And it's not only because it'll be more expensive for those military academic institutions. As I think everybody knows on this call, DoD is pretty much the only agency in the US government that gets subsidized by the Congress for having people in professional education. The State Department does not. Most of the civilian intelligence agencies does not. Law enforcement does not. So when they send somebody to one of our academic institutions, they're absorbing an enormous amount of workforce pain inside their own structure because they can't replace those people. That's not something DoD has to suffer with. There ought to be legislation, in my view, to support a similar kind of formula for our civilian agencies so they can actually afford to send people to academic institutions where they develop relationships, personal friendships with military professionals. But it doesn't stop there. In a way that perhaps is a little reminiscent of what we all remember happened in the Goldwater-Nichols Act, where perhaps the most important clause in the Goldwater-Nichols Act was that if you didn't go joint, you weren't going to get promoted. There ought to be a similar thing about if you don't go work in a non-DoD agency for a chunk of your career, you won't get promoted. I had the great fortune of serving twice in an intelligence agency. And I learned so many things I would have never have known before that became damn useful when I was having to operate with these agencies in a forward deployed arena. But these are one-offs. These are not constant, they're not consistent, and they're not strong enough. This will require funding as well, may require some regulatory policy or legislative change to boot. I'm not enough of an expert, but absolutely, there are many changes that have to be made.
I already know your answer to this question because it's the answer you gave me 20 years ago in Fort Lewis, Washington. But I'm going to ask it anyway. Sir, please share with us your thoughts on the importance of allies and partners and partnered approaches given the convergence you speak of. That's a softball, sir.
It is indeed. Well, yes, a lot of this harkens back to your and my time together, but let's face it, Russ, I was learning all this stuff from you, so I'm just parroting stuff I've heard you say. But anyways, back to your question, or back to the question. A lot of this is going to sound a little similar to what I've said about how we should change the way in which we relate to professionals in our own non-DoD agencies. In my opinion, we should take a very similar, if not completely identical tack with our foreign partners. This is, you know, now as soon as I say some of this, anybody who's a security manager in the room is going to probably have their head explode, because it's going to probably sound like I'm suggesting we should willy-nilly start crossing all kinds of red lines about compartmentation and classification of sensitive information or intelligence. That's not what I'm trying to suggest, but these are realities that do what I'm about to suggest make more complicated. We don't do enough, either as special operations forces, but more broadly in the US military. We do not do enough to educate, train, prepare, and operate along with coalition partners. Now, we're a lot better than we once were. I want to give credit where credit is due. When I compare how effectively we can collaborate with coalition partners today compared to the way we were 20, 30 years ago, oh my God, the transformation has been amazing, but it's still not good enough. It's still not good enough. We still have miles to go because the challenge we're facing is getting more complex and more difficult, particularly when you add, as I tried to emphasize in my prepared remarks, the advent of the digital age and how increasingly our competitors or our adversaries have access to incredible first world digital technology that is literally changing the face of human civilization right in front of our eyes. That means the way in which we have learned, in many ways very effectively, to partner with allies and partners around the world, as proud of the progress as we should be, is still not good enough because the goalpost keeps moving farther and farther away from us. So pretty much everything we currently do to cultivate effective partnerships, task forces, coalition headquarters, et cetera, with our allies and partners around the world, all of it has to get better because the goalpost keeps moving away.
This perhaps last question, depending on the length of your answer, is, well, to preface this, about 35% of our audience is from the reserve component. So this is a reserve component type question. How can we reimagine the value of the Reserve and National Guard personnel who have both civilian and military expertise? How might we emphasize the value of their civilian profession over their MOS profession? How might we combine them?
That is a great question. Well, what I'm about to say probably doesn't apply to everyone in the audience. So if this shoe does not fit, do not try to wear it. But I will say this, and I'm saying this primarily to my military colleagues who have served or are serving on active duty. I've heard the words Russ has used, that we should have due regard and we should leverage the expertise, the civilian expertise of our colleagues that come from the reserves and the National Guard. They have business experience, they have local governance experience, they have law enforcement experience, they have investment experience, they have all kinds of experience. We'll say that, but too often it's lip service. And we don't actually seriously, consistently take advantage of it. Instead, we'll say these words and then basically mission them the way we mission all the active forces. And that's, frankly, whether we intend it or not, it's hypocritical and it's self-defeating. So we need to be less hypocritical about this. And I've probably been occasionally guilty of this as well. I tried not to be guilty of this, but it's so simple to just treat, for example, a National Guard Special Forces ODA like they're mix and match with everybody else, that it's easy to fall into that intellectual trap. But we should have more discipline than that. You know, frankly, when I made this mistake, I should have been more disciplined about it. But that's not my only answer. The second answer is this. We should be more willing than we have been to put those Reserve and National Guard personnel in leadership positions, because in some arenas and in some missions, their expertise is the most important form of expertise. Now, it probably makes a few people's hair stand on end to think that, oh my God, but I'm an active duty senior military officer. I'm not going to have some National Guard officer run my outfit or run my mission or give me orders. My answer to that is, why not? That sounds like pride as opposed to a desire to succeed. So, like I said, if the shoe doesn't fit, don't wear it, but there's my answer.
It's a good answer, sir, because the operations officer for this whole forum is a National Guard officer, and she is ecstatic now that you said that. Sir, thank you so much for your time today and your comments. You are the perfect keynote for this particular forum, and I hope we can impose on you again as we carry on with our future forums. Thanks again, sir. Very much appreciate your time.
Russ, it is my pleasure, and thank you again for inviting me, you particularly, because it was you specifically that threw a lasso around me and roped me into this. I hope I've not disappointed you. More broadly, for everyone at the Joint Special Operations University, thank you for facilitating this. I've been a lifelong fan or a career-long fan of JSOU, and I will always be. But finally, for the audience, thank you for listening to me. I hope something in my blizzard of remarks today was of some value to you. I'll just leave you with this. After 34 years in SOF, I miss the hell out of you guys, all of you. I'll never, I'm happy I'm doing interesting things. I like the people I work with, but I'll never see the likes of you ever again. And I miss you, and I wish you all the best. Take care and Godspeed.
Thanks again, sir. Thank you so much.